There are those who cross the entrance to the temple with a hidden conflict in their chest. It's not always visible, but it's there. A tension between duty and sincerity, between tradition and understanding. The music plays, the eyes close, and the gestures are repeated. But within many hearts, there remains a question that never finds space to be asked out loud. When talking about tithing, what exactly is at stake? Faith, obedience, fear, load. Behind every envelope left at the altar, there is a story. A woman who barely managed to pay her rent that month. A family man who feels torn between feeding his children and honoring what he learned as a child. A young man who has just come to faith but already feels the weight of expectations that he does not understand. The topic of tithing does not appear as a simple practice among many others, but as a delicate point that directly touches on finances, conscience, guilt, and freedom. In many churches, tithing is treated as a spiritual thermometer. Anyone who doesn't deliver is seen as unfaithful, uncommitted, or carnal. Texts are read with emphasis, promises are made vehemently, and warnings are issued sternly. But space is rarely made for an honest inquiry into what Scripture actually says, and, perhaps more importantly, what it does not say. This silence creates a culture where what has been learned is repeated, without necessarily understanding the roots, the context, or the nuances. For a long time, tithing was taught as an immutable rule, linked directly to the will of God. 10%. A clear, direct, indisputable number. But was this percentage born from a universal divine imposition, or was it a specific practice by a people, at a time, with a defined purpose? And more, did the Christian faith, shaped in the light of the gospel, maintain this structure or point to something deeper, more relational, more free? Questions accumulate, but they do not always receive answers, not because of a lack of biblical text, but because of fear of challenging structures. Questioning tithing, for many, is like walking on sacred ground without taking off your sandals. But doesn't the sanctity of the theme require just the opposite? Take off your shoes, step with reverence, and review with honesty. The problem is not in contributing, in supporting the community, or in supporting causes that promote good. The problem is transforming the act of giving into a spiritual bargaining chip, into a contract disguised as devotion. It involves using faith as a tool of pressure, as a means of control, as a justification for emotionally exploiting those who most need care. When the act of offering is guided by guilt, it loses its beauty. When the value given becomes required as proof of loyalty, generosity becomes empty. And when people feel threatened by not giving, something essential to faith breaks down: trust. The time we live in calls for maturity. It is no longer enough to repeat random verses. It is necessary to delve into the context, understand the story, and listen to what is behind the text. Many ideas that have become common over the years have no solid basis in early Christian practice. Others were reinterpreted by interests, adjusted by traditions, and shaped to maintain structures. But there is a search that remains alive, finding the essence, that which, even as time passes, continues to resonate as truth. Perhaps this is an opportunity to reconcile with something that has always felt like an obligation. Maybe it's time to discover that contributing to the kingdom of God can be lighter, more true, and more liberating. Faith has never been about fixed numbers, but about genuine surrender. And generosity, when born from a heart at peace, has a value that goes far beyond any percentage. If you value a more conscious approach to faith and practice, subscribe to the channel. Here, each topic is treated with seriousness, depth, and respect for your journey. Following this path can bring more clarity than ready-made certainties. Understanding tithing does not begin with laws or obligations. To understand its roots, it is necessary to go back many centuries before the formation of Israel as a nation, even before the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. The first clear record of a practice similar to tithing appears at a time that does not involve a commandment, punishment, or requirement. It involves a spontaneous gesture. In an episode described in the book of Genesis, more specifically in chapter 14, a man named Abraham, who would later have his name changed to Abraham, returns from a battle where he freed his nephew Lot. After this victory, he encounters an enigmatic figure called Melchizedek, described as a priest of the Most High God. Without anyone asking him, Abraham gives this priest a tenth of the spoils he conquered. This event is placed by scholars around the 19th century BC. It is important to realize that there was still no formal religious system there, no temple, no priestly tribe, no commandments. Abraham does not respond to a norm, but to a spiritual experience. His attitude is born of gratitude and recognition that his victory was not just the result of his strength, but of something greater. From that point on, tithing begins to take shape within the biblical tradition, but it is only centuries later that it becomes part of a legal structure. When the Hebrew people are freed from slavery in Egypt and led by Moses into the desert, a new social and spiritual organization is established. In this context, tithing is included as part of the covenant that God makes with his people. In the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, tithing becomes a recurring practice, but with clear and well-defined objectives. He was not, as many think today, just a temple offering. It was a triple mechanism that fulfilled different social and spiritual functions. Firstly, it served to support the Levites, a tribe separated to perform religious functions, but which did not have land for cultivation. They were responsible for the tabernacle, and later the temple, and depended on tithes for subsistence. Furthermore, the legislation determined that every 3 years, part of the tithe should be collected for the poor, widows, orphans, and foreigners. This was a way to ensure that the most vulnerable in society were not forgotten, a care for social justice that, unfortunately, has been lost in many current interpretations of the practice. Another little-remembered aspect is that part of the tithe was intended to promote parties and collective celebrations. The people should keep a portion of the production to rejoice together before God. Tithing was not just institutional maintenance, but also an invitation to communion and shared joy. Over time, this system began to wear out. The heart of the practice, which was gratitude and justice, was being replaced by formality. In moments of spiritual crisis, the prophets denounced this distortion. A striking example appears in the book of Malachi, written around the 5th century BC, already in the post-exilic period. There, God confronts the people for neglecting tithes and offerings, but the issue is not just financial. What is at stake is loyalty, the broken alliance, and indifference to a pact that was based on trust and mutual care. Over the years, many have come to treat tithing as a mechanical obligation rather than a sincere response to God. This change in stance profoundly affected the symbolic value of the delivery. What began as a voluntary gesture became a lifeless ritual, and when this happens, even what was instituted wisely runs the risk of losing its meaning. It is essential to remember that, even within the Old Testament, the tithe was not a single and fixed amount as is generally taught. There were different types of tithes at different times, with different purposes. There was a regular tithe for the Levites, a 3-year tithe for those in need, and other contributions and offerings that were also part of the culture of giving. All of this shows that the principle behind tithing was much broader than a percentage. It involved recognition, generosity, justice, and communion. It was not an exchange with God, but a reflection of the relationship between the people and their faith. From the moment this understanding was lost, the practice began to be used in ways that moved away from its original intention. Looking at this trajectory helps to understand that tithing, in the ancient context, was a contextualized response to the needs of a community under construction. It emerged as an instrument of balance, inclusion, and worship. But like every human structure, it was also the target of corruption, manipulation, and forgetfulness of its initial purpose. Jesus' words marked a profound break with many of the religious standards established until then. Throughout his ministry, he challenged rigid traditions, exposed the hypocrisy of authorities, and proposed a spirituality that was born from the inside out. In the midst of these discussions, tithing appeared, but not in the way many would expect. Jesus did not remain silent on the topic, but he also did not address it as the center of his message. What he did was shift the focus from the visible act to the invisible motivation, the state of the heart. One of the most emblematic moments in which he mentions tithing is recorded in the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 23. Faced with religious leaders known for their extreme zeal, Jesus launches a scathing criticism. He accuses them of being meticulous in separating the 10th part of even the most insignificant herbs, such as mint and cumin, but neglecting the pillars of faith, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. This statement does not directly condemn the act of tithing. On the contrary, Jesus recognizes that these practices had their place. What he confronts is the inversion of values. While energy was spent on external aspects of religiosity, what really mattered, such as care for others, integrity, and love, was left aside. The problem, therefore, was not tithing itself, but what it had become, a sign of appearance, a mark of spiritual status, an empty symbol. This same criticism is repeated on another occasion, reported by Luke. Once again, Jesus addresses the Pharisees, accusing them of observing the details of the law rigorously, but of distancing themselves from compassion and truth. What he proposes is a deeper religiosity, less concerned with performance and more interested in inner transformation. Throughout his teachings, Jesus makes it clear that religious practice without a heart aligned with the values of the kingdom loses its value. It tells the story of two men who go up to the temple to pray. One of them, a Pharisee, exalts himself by fasting and giving tithes of everything he has. The other, a publican, recognizes himself as a sinner and asks for mercy. At the conclusion of the parable, it is the second who receives divine approval. This contrast is not in the action itself, but in the intention behind it. Jesus is not interested in appearances. His focus has always been on authenticity. In a context where religious practices have become social markers, he pointed to the essence. Faith, for him, was not proven by percentages given, but by visible fruits of a transformed life, forgiveness, empathy, and spontaneous generosity. An example that strongly echoes this teaching is that of the poor widow who gives 2 small coins to the temple. While many rich people offered large sums openly, she gave everything she had, silently. Jesus observes and declares that, among all, she was the one who gave the most. Not because of the numerical value, but because his delivery was complete, sincere, and detached. This episode clearly highlights the principle he defended. The greatness of an offering is not in its size, but in the sacrifice involved, in the interior disposition. This revolutionary approach changes the way we see the relationship between humans and God. Instead of external demands, Jesus proposes freedom with responsibility. Instead of cold norms, he teaches a surrender that is born of love. Spirituality is now measured not by rituals, but by the way one lives. Financial delivery, in this context, ceases to be a duty and becomes an act of communion. In the famous Sermon on the Mount, he goes even deeper when he says that no one can serve 2 masters. Either you serve God or you serve money. Here, he does not discuss percentages, but loyalty. The challenge is not to calculate how much to give, but to decide who it belongs to. Delivery, therefore, cannot be a transaction. It needs to be an answer. Response to a renewed conscience, a converted heart, a willing spirit. This teaching contrasts radically with religious practices that associate blessings with the quantity delivered. Jesus never promised riches as a reward for financial faithfulness. On the contrary, he warned of the danger of trusting in riches and encouraged his followers to live simply and confidently. It wasn't about a miserable life, but about an inner freedom that wasn't tied to accumulation. As a result, the logic of tithing as an imposition loses its meaning. The relationship with God, according to Jesus, is not based on contracts or demands, but on a bond. And every healthy bond is based on freedom, not on demands. When observing his teachings, it is evident that Jesus does not reinforce tithing as an obligatory practice. He mentions it, but always in contexts of criticism or reflection. Your proposal is higher, more demanding, and more true. He wants more than a fraction of what you have. He wants the whole heart, surrendered, willing, and sensitive. After Jesus' ascension, his disciples were faced with the challenge of establishing a community of faith without the mold of the previous religious system. They not only transmitted the Master's teachings, but they also needed to form a structure that was consistent with the principles of the gospel. In this new scenario, the relationship with material goods assumed a practical and deeply symbolic role. In the first records of the early church, described in the book of Acts, it is possible to observe a striking pattern: sharing. Men and women converted to the Christian faith, moved by a sense of unity, and began to pool their resources. Land and properties were sold, and the proceeds of these sales were given to meet the needs of the brothers. There was no fixed commandment requiring this practice, but a natural movement was born from the spirit of communion. This behavior completely broke with the logic of the percentage obligation. No one was pressured to give a specific value. What was seen was the expression of a voluntary commitment driven by empathy and solidarity. This type of delivery, spontaneous and collective, was not regulated by tables, but by the sense of responsibility for the well-being of others. An episode that illustrates this dynamic well involves a couple called Ananias and Sapphira. They sold an asset, but decided to keep part of the value for themselves, pretending to have given everything away. The problem, according to the biblical narrative, was not withholding a part, but lying about the motivation. This reinforces the idea that what was expected was not total value, but the integrity of the heart. It was possible to contribute less, or even not contribute at all, as long as the stance was true. The seriousness of the situation was not in the amount, but in the attempt to simulate a devotion that did not exist. With the growth of churches outside Jerusalem, especially among the Gentiles, new guidelines were being created. The Apostle Paul, for example, addressed the issue of offerings in several letters. Instead of imposing fixed rules, he encouraged a culture of generosity that respected each person's circumstances. When writing to the Christians in Corinth, he invites them to contribute to their needy brothers in Judea, but emphasizes that each one must donate as they have decided internally, without sadness or embarrassment. This principle reveals a deep understanding of Christian freedom. Giving should not be driven by fear or vanity, but by conviction and love. Paulo's guidance is clear. The contribution must be proportional, according to individual capacity. It does not define a mandatory fraction, but points to the balance between willingness and possibility. Another important point in his letters is the way he relates generosity and spirituality. He states that whoever plants little reaps little, whoever sows bountifully reaps bountifully. However, this harvest is not presented as a direct financial return, but as a fruit of spiritual growth, contentment, and grace. The reward, from his perspective, is in building the community and in the peace that accompanies a life consistent with kingdom values. In the practical instructions left to the churches, Paul suggests that each person set aside a particular amount at the beginning of the week, according to how much they have prospered. This detail reveals the flexibility and sensitivity of the proposed model. There is no single standard to be followed, but a call to awareness and personal discipline. Each individual is invited to reflect on their reality and act with intention. It is curious to note that even in the midst of real needs, such as persecution, poverty among Jewish believers, and the logistical challenges of missionary trips, the apostles did not resort to imposing a mandatory system such as tithing, They relied on the transformation of the heart as the basis for the practice of surrender. The change of mentality was more effective than any norm. This model was so striking that it profoundly influenced the way in which the first Christian communities organized themselves. The collective good was a priority. Leadership was sustained with respect, but without exploitation. Mutual help was constant, and the value given was always associated with what you had, not what you expected. This environment allowed donation to be seen not as a duty, but as a privilege. The practice of the apostles, therefore, does not reinforce the maintenance of a fixed percentage as a spiritual obligation. On the contrary, it makes room for a more human approach, sensitive and adjusted to each person's reality. Instead of transferring blame or establishing threats, what we see is an invitation to participate in the mission of the gospel with freedom and conscience. The generosity taught and experienced by them is not born from a table, but from a transformative experience with God's love. And it is this experience that shapes the behavior of those who are part of the community. The commitment becomes to the other, to justice, to equity. Money, in this scenario, does not occupy the center. It becomes half, an instrument serving a greater purpose. As the centuries passed, the simplicity experienced by Christian communities in the first century was gradually replaced by more complex structures, robust institutions, and diverse interpretations of sacred texts. Among the topics that have undergone the most transformations is the practice of tithing. What began as a gesture of gratitude and solidarity has transformed, in many modern contexts, into a systematic demand, often accompanied by spiritual promises or threats. One of the most striking distortions in this process is the emergence of what is conventionally called prosperity theology. This line of thought, popular especially in the 20th century, argues that faith must be expressed through acts of financial sowing, and that this attitude will be rewarded by God with material blessings, health, success, and stability. Tithing, within this logic, stops being a conscious response to divine goodness and starts to be treated as a key to access guaranteed rewards. This type of teaching has gained strength, especially in countries with great economic inequality, where many people face chronic financial difficulties. In these contexts, the message that faithful tithing can be the solution to scarcity has become extremely seductive. Churches that have adopted this approach have grown in number and influence, supported by persuasive campaigns, carefully selected testimonies, and speeches that blend biblical texts with emotional promises. However, when analyzing the content of this theology in light of the gospel, a worrying deviation is noticed. Christ-centered spirituality has always been marked by detachment, service, and the willingness to give up in favor of others. Jesus never offered riches as a reward for obedience. On the contrary, he talked about denying himself, carrying the cross, and living contentedly. Nor did the apostles teach that material prosperity was proof of divine approval. Many of them even faced poverty, persecution, and extreme difficulties, even though they were faithful to the call they received. The idea that giving money to the church is a way of multiplying goods or ensuring spiritual protection distorts the purpose of Christian generosity. By transforming the offer into currency, it deprives the value of love for others and true trust. Instead of a free act, surrender becomes a tool of manipulation, where the motivation is no longer gratitude, but the expectation of return. In many environments, leaders began to use tithing as a criterion to measure member loyalty. Anyone who contributes is valued, heard, and recognized. Those who do not deliver the expected value are judged, disciplined, or even excluded. This practice violates the principle of the gospel that places everyone on an equal footing before God. Acceptance should not depend on the amount offered, but on the willing heart. Furthermore, the indiscriminate use of isolated verses to justify campaigns and financial obligations creates a culture of emotional dependence. Passages such as those from the prophet Malachi are often cited outside of their historical context, transforming an exhortation addressed to a specific people into a universal and timeless commandment. The risk of this approach is to transform faith into a collection system and not into a living relationship with the Creator. Another serious impact of this distortion is the separation of people who feel overwhelmed. Many leave the faith community because they are unable to maintain the financial demands imposed. Others remain, but live in a constant feeling of guilt, fear, and frustration. Instead of freeing, the speech imprisons. Instead of consoling, it oppresses. Generosity, when surrounded by pressure, loses its shine and becomes a burden. It is important to highlight that not every church or leadership adopts these practices. There are many communities that treat the topic of contributions with respect, balance, and clarity. However, the problem worsens when those who question the current model are seen as rebels or infidels. The lack of space for dialogue and review creates an environment where tithing is no longer an expression of faith, but an unquestionable taboo. In the current scenario, there are a growing number of Christians who are reviewing their way of contributing. Motivated by a sincere desire to live a coherent faith, many have sought more in-depth information on the topic, analyzing the scriptures in their original context and looking for ways to exercise their generosity in a responsible way. This change in stance does not represent abandonment of the practice, but an attempt to rescue its essence. What can be seen is that tithing, when associated with a promise of enrichment or an imposed obligation, loses its spiritual nature. It becomes a bargaining instrument where people give themselves expecting something in return. However, the gospel message points in another direction: giving because you love, offering because you believe, contributing because you want to share. The criticism, therefore, is not against the practice itself, but against the abuses that surround it. It is possible to contribute frequently, with commitment and generosity, without this being the result of imposition or emotional strategy. Surrender must be a reflection of spiritual maturity, not fear or ambition. When observing the entire trajectory of this practice, from its origins to its most recent uses, it is inevitable to recognize how much the idea of contribution was shaped by different interests and contexts. What was once a sign of recognition and collective care in many places began to carry weight, demands, and even fear. This transformation reveals more than external changes. It betrays a disconnect with the spirit of the gospel. Jesus' proposal was always rooted in freedom. He did not set spiritual tariffs, nor did he tie God's grace to percentages. On the contrary, he pointed to an experience where surrender was an expression of love, not a rigid duty. Commitment to others, justice and compassion always came before rights. And where the heart is present, generosity happens naturally. Therefore, perhaps it is time to recover the original meaning of delivery, not as a formula to receive blessings, nor as a currency of exchange with the divine, but as a voluntary attitude consistent with the faith we live. The contribution can be generous without being forced. It can be constant without being required. And above all, it can be transformative when it is born from awareness, not from imposition. What God observes is not the exact sum, but the intention that guides the gesture. A simple act, done with truth, can be worth more than many actions repeated out of obligation. The value of delivery is not in what is lost, but in what is shared. When it is done with understanding, what is built goes far beyond finances. It touches lives, strengthens bonds, and reflects character. Spiritual maturity passes through this place, knowing why you do what you do. Questioning is not losing faith, it is deepening it. Reviewing practices is not abandoning the essence, it is protecting it. And giving with conscience is, in many cases, the most sincere way to worship. Because at the end of the day, what God is looking for are not numbers, but available hearts. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so we can continue to bring you more research and in-depth analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps the channel grow and produce even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support. If this content helped you reflect more clearly on this topic, consider subscribing to the channel here, so you can follow the next videos and continue this journey of understanding and awareness. Also, take the opportunity to leave your like. This helps us spread this conversation to more people. And stay tuned, because soon we will bring a new video with another perspective that expands this dialogue even further. I'll wait for you there.